Hello everybody, my name is Dwayne Massey and welcome back to my YouTube channel and my YouTube video entitled How We Learn Part 1. Lecture material that go along with this video can be found on my website www.masseyinstitute.com. If you want to stop this video at this point and download these materials, please do so. Go to the website, select the lecture material tab, select the title of this video, and print out the associated material. You can then follow along on it as the video progresses. You may restart the video when you are ready to do so. Let's go ahead and get started. As we have covered, environment shapes and directs the course of sports behavior and all behavior. What we learn dictates how we perform and determines the level we perform at. So, how do we learn? The primary ways identified in psychology are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and what can be termed cognitive learning. Classical conditioning can be defined as conditioning in which the conditioning stimulus is paired with and precedes the unconditioned stimulus until the conditioned stimulus alone is sufficient to elicit the response. That is a mouthful. How many of you have ever driven home and once you got there did not remember the process of the drive itself? And you were not drunk or high at the time? Driving is something that some of us do so much, and is something that is so ingrained in our psyche that we often do not have to consciously think about it. And you probably did it pretty safely. That, at its essence, is classical conditioning. The most prominent person in classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. Ivan and his dog. Pavlov conducted an experiment in which he gave a dog a bowl containing meat powder. This caused the dog to begin salivating. An unconditioned response. A natural response. Over time, Pavlov would ring a bell, use a buzzer, or set off a metronome prior to giving the dog the meat powder. Eventually, the bell, the buzzer, the metronome was sufficient by itself to elicit the salivation response. The dog had come to associate the bell, the buzzer, the metronome with the prospect of being fed. In the classical conditioning process, you start out with an unconditioned stimulus, in this case the meat powder. You have an unconditioned response, salivation. You add in a conditioned stimulus, the bell, the buzzer, the metronome, and eventually you get a conditioned response, the salivation. So in classical conditioning, you tie a conditioned stimulus to an unconditioned stimulus, and eventually you get a conditioned response. You may be saying to yourself, so what? What relevance does that have for me? Well, there are some applications of classical conditioning to sports. One is a process called counterconditioning. Say a baseball player becomes focused on the boos, jeers, and negative comments directed toward him every time he goes up to bat. Over time, when it is his time to go up to the plate, he becomes overwhelmed with anxiety and negative thoughts. The dread he experiences reaches the point of almost being an outright phobia, and his performance inevitably begins to suffer. What a sports psychologist can do in these cases is they can assist the person in reaching a relaxed state. They then ask the person to bring up and get in touch with those negative feelings they experience when they take an at-bat. After this, the athlete is again asked and assisted to relax. The sports psychologist goes about systematically replacing the counterproductive thought pattern with positive, pleasant thoughts more conducive to successful performance. The premise behind counterconditioning is that you cannot hold two competing and opposite ideas in your mind at the same time. You cannot focus on being anxious and afraid while at the same time having pleasant, relaxing, anticipatory thoughts about performing in your sport. Classical conditioning techniques can be used to recall performance strategies. This involves cues to help the athlete remember strategies in the heat of competition. An aspect of Murphy's Law is no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Classical conditioning techniques can help us remember how we want to respond in a situation in the heat of battle. If this happens, this will be my reaction. and if this occurs, this will be my response. These responses can become so ingrained in us, we just respond automatically. Learning should take place in the precise conditions they will be performed. Practice on the field you are going to play. That is why during away games, coaches will hold at least one practice on the field they're going to play the game on. Practice in front of a crowd. Coaches have been known to pipe in crowd noise during practice to get their players used to game-type conditions. We often don't perform well if we've never been in a situation before. A practical use of imagery is to allow us to put ourselves in a situation, if only in our minds. Walt Hazzard was a great player on one of John Wooden's teams at UCLA that eventually won 10 national NCAA championships in basketball. About playing for Coach Wooden, Hazzard said, "We saw the same things in practice every day so much that when these situations occurred in games, we instinctively knew how to respond." This is an example of classical conditioning. We respond without having to give it conscious thought. The America's Cup is a yacht race. It is the oldest continuous athletic competition in the world, and at one time was the longest continuous winning streak in the world, with a team from the United States winning the competition over a 132-year period. The Cup has been held every 3 or 4 years over the history of the event. In the 1983 event, the Australian team fielded a strong challenger to American dominance. In preparation for the competition, the leaders of the Australians became concerned that because of America's long dominance in the event, the Australian team may not believe they could win, and their lack of belief may contribute to a loss due to a self-fulfilling prophecy. To combat this possibility, the Australians brought in a sports psychologist. The sports psychologist brought the members of the racing team together and had them lay down as a group. He then assisted them to reach a relaxed state. He then had them visualize what it would be like on the day of the race. He had them visualize what the weather would be like, the spray of the ocean in their faces. He had them visualize doing their respective jobs during the race. He then had them visualize experiencing success during the race. And finally, he had them visualize winning the race and experience all the positive emotions that went along with that outcome. The Australian boat went on to win the competition. It did not hurt that the Australians had a revolutionary new keel that helped their boat go faster. But it was a close contest, and many attributed much of their success to the confidence they were able to develop in their preparation for the event. It was also felt that this newfound confidence helped them overcome adversity when it occurred during the contest. The Australians were not surprised when they won because they anticipated being successful. Again, this example contains strong elements of classical conditioning. This wraps up our discussion today on how we learn, part 1. In conclusion, as always, I hope something we said today was useful and had some relevance to you. Be on the lookout for my next video, which I hope to post in the relatively near future. Again, be sure to check out my webpage, www.masseyinstitute.com. Additional information about sports psychology and the topics discussed can be found there. Also, if you like what you see today, be sure to subscribe to this channel. And be sure to leave comments, as I'm interested in what you think of these efforts. Thank you so much for watching today.